In this video, we'll be talking about the transport of respiratory gases in the blood. So we're of course talking about oxygen and carbon dioxide. To orient ourselves in our list of functions of the respiratory system, we're talking about number 3 here, transport of respiratory gases. This is what has to happen to get from external respiration to internal respiration. You have to get that oxygen to the tissues, and you have to get that carbon dioxide from the tissues to the lungs. Now, we can't talk about gas transport without talking about hemoglobin, so this should be a bit of a review from our discussion of the blood. But hemoglobin is a protein in red blood cells. It's made up of 4 polypeptide chains, 2 beta chains and 2 alpha chains, and each of these polypeptide chains has a heme group sitting in it, which has an iron atom in the center, and this iron atom binds oxygen. Now, both oxygen and carbon dioxide are carried on hemoglobin. Only about 1 to 1.5% of your oxygen is actually dissolved in your plasma. The rest is carried on that iron atom in hemoglobin. So basically almost all of your oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. And about 1/4 of your carbon dioxide is bound to hemoglobin. But the carbon dioxide doesn't bind to the heme group. Carbon dioxide actually binds to the amino acids of the globin chains. So it doesn't compete with oxygen. They're carried in different locations. So because of this arrangement of hemoglobin, where you have 4 heme groups, each capable of binding an oxygen molecule, each hemoglobin molecule binds 4 oxygen molecules. The binding of oxygen to hemoglobin is rapid and reversible. It's important that this be reversible because hemoglobin doesn't actually leave the red blood cells. If you need that oxygen to get to the tissues, it has to come off the hemoglobin, pass through the plasma, and then get into the interstitial fluid. So the ability of oxygen to come off hemoglobin is just as important to getting oxygen to the tissues as having a sufficient amount of hemoglobin. Now, this equation shows you the reaction of hemoglobin with oxygen. Hemoglobin plus oxygen is called oxyhemoglobin. Hemoglobin without oxygen is called reduced hemoglobin because it's lost its oxygen, but also deoxyhemoglobin. Right? This forwards and backwards arrow shows that it's a reversible reaction. Now, since each hemoglobin molecule can bind 4 oxygen molecules, you can have hemoglobin that is fully saturated. So if you have 4 O2, you have fully saturated hemoglobin. If you have only 1, 2, or 3 oxygen molecules bound, you have what's called partially saturated hemoglobin. So the term saturation refers to the extent to which hemoglobin is full of oxygen. Fully saturated means it's completely full, it's got all the oxygen it can take. Partially saturated means it has some, but not quite all it can take. Hemoglobin also shows what's called cooperative binding. What that means is that when you have 1 oxygen molecule bound to hemoglobin, it's easier for the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th to bind. And this holds true for dissociation as well, when the oxygen comes off the hemoglobin. So that when that first oxygen molecule leaves, it's easier for the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th to come off. Now, since it's important for oxygen to be able to come off of hemoglobin, a lot of research has been done to figure out the rate at which oxygen comes off hemoglobin and what conditions contribute to that dissociation. It's called dissociation when oxygen comes off of hemoglobin. And what you're looking at here is the curve that has been calculated, the hemoglobin dissociation curve. You could also think of it as the hemoglobin saturation curve. you're looking at here on the y-axis the percent saturation of hemoglobin. So basically, how saturated is the hemoglobin? On the x-axis here, you're looking at the pressure of oxygen in the blood. So this is basically the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. And as you look, you can see that it has this, it's not a straight line. It's has a bit of a curve to it, and that curve is due to cooperative binding. When I'm looking at this curve and I'm trying to figure out what this curve means and thinking about it and really understanding it, I like to actually start over here at the right. I know it's a little bit backwards from how you usually may approach a curve, but the reason why I like to start here is because here at the right, this is the lungs. This is where you have the greatest partial pressure of oxygen that you're ever going to see in the body, is right at the lungs. So it's like this is the starting point over here. Okay? Now notice how this initial part of the curve is pretty flat. So initially it takes actually a pretty significant drop in blood oxygen levels before you actually get a drop in hemoglobin saturation. So you can have the partial pressure of oxygen has to drop pretty low before hemoglobin saturation is affected. This is part of why humans can live in such a broad range of elevations, because we can take a pretty broad range of different atmospheric concentrations of oxygen before we actually start to see impaired transport in the blood. Now, as you're moving down, you can basically think of moving down this curve as getting further and further away from the lungs. You're getting into more and more metabolically active tissues. So at resting tissues, the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is about 40, and you have approximately 75% hemoglobin saturation. So the difference between these two, that's the amount of oxygen that's been dropped off by hemoglobin and sent out to the tissues, for the tissues to use. If you look at highly metabolically active tissues, like exercising muscle, they're going to be consuming a lot more oxygen. So the partial pressure of oxygen is going to be a lot lower. Highly metabolically active tissues, it's more like a little under 20 millimeters mercury. So the hemoglobin saturation is about 25%. So the difference between these two, that's the additional amount of oxygen that can be dropped off when the tissues need it the most. Notice how this curve is really steep in here. It's that steep dissociation curve. What that means is that the release of oxygen from hemoglobin is very responsive to decreases in blood oxygen levels. So as you are, so that your tissues, your working tissues, can get exactly as much oxygen as they need. There are a number of different factors that affect hemoglobin saturation. Temperature is one. As body temperature increases, hemoglobin gets a lower affinity for oxygen. So what that means is that hemoglobin doesn't bind oxygen as well, and you get more oxygen release. pH affects hemoglobin saturation as well. Increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and a lowered blood pH. And remember that these two go together. So when you have an increased carbon dioxide, you tend to have a lower blood pH. Both of these decrease hemoglobin binding to oxygen. So both of these lead to more oxygen unloaded off of hemoglobin, where it can be released into the plasma and taken up by the tissues. And this third factor is something called BPG, and BPG is produced by glycolysis in your red blood cells. Okay, and since red blood cells don't have mitochondria, they're constantly doing glycolysis, so they're constantly producing BPG. The more BPG that you have, the greater oxygen unloading that you have, and increased body temperature also increases synthesis of BPG. So you get more BPG made when your body's warmer. Now, if BPG levels get too low, oxygen won't unload at all. So BPG is actually essential for oxygen unloading. And this actually has some clinical implications because BPG levels drop in stored blood over time. So if you work at a blood bank and you have some blood stored in the fridge, eventually those BPG levels will get so low that the blood is absolutely useless for transfusion. It can't release its oxygen, so it's not going to be able to transport oxygen to the tissues. It's not going to be able to release oxygen to the tissues. Now, I want you to think about what happens when you're exercising, when you're working your muscles, say when you have metabolically active tissue. When you have metabolically active tissue, body temperature goes up, you get more carbon dioxide production, and so a drop in pH. You get increased body temperature is going to lead to increased BPG synthesis. All of these factors tilt hemoglobin saturation to unloading exactly when you need it the most. The more metabolically active your tissue is, the warmer it is, the more carbon dioxide you have, the more BPG you have, the more oxygen your hemoglobin is going to release. It's kind of a nifty system. So all of these factors affect hemoglobin saturation. I want to show you that in terms of looking at the saturation curve. So this is looking at both pH on the left and temperature on the right and the effect it has on the saturation curve. So you've got in dark blue you have a typical blood pH, 7.4. When you have accumulation of carbon dioxide and you have a drop in blood pH, that takes blood pH down to say 7.2, that shifts this whole saturation curve to the right. So that means that if you look at any blood oxygen level, so let's say 40 resting tissues, now hemoglobin is going to be less saturated for any given concentration of oxygen. With a more acidic blood, hemoglobin is less saturated than normal blood. Same thing happens when you're warming up. The yellow line is a typical body temperature, 38 degrees Celsius. As you get colder, the hemoglobin saturation curve shifts to the left. As temperature rises, it shifts to the right. So again, if we draw our more or less straight line, you can see that for any given oxygen partial pressure, at a warmer body temperature, hemoglobin is less saturated. Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about carbon dioxide transport now. Some carbon dioxide is transported dissolved in the plasma. About 7% is dissolved in the plasma. About 23% is found in your red blood cells bound to hemoglobin. And as I mentioned, it binds to the amino acids of hemoglobin, so it binds to the protein portion. And sometimes that hemoglobin carbon dioxide compound is referred to as carbaminohemoglobin. Again, just stressing that it's bound to the protein region, not the same place as oxygen. So they aren't competing. About 70% of the carbon dioxide, so the majority of the carbon dioxide, is converted to carbonic acid and it's converted by an enzyme in the red blood cell called carbonic anhydrase. So if you take carbon dioxide and the water in the blood, it becomes carbonic acid. This is the reaction catalyzed by carbonic anhydrase, catalyzed by that enzyme. Now, carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen and bicarbonate. Okay? And this bicarbonate, this HCO3 there, bicarbonate is actually moved out of the red blood cell into the plasma through something called the chloride shift. So this chloride shift, that's just basically an exchange. The red blood cell pulls in chloride and moves out bicarbonate at the same time. So it's able to it's able to maintain electrical neutrality. It's called an anion exchanger. It just switches one negatively charged ion for another. Moves chloride in, bicarbonate out. So since this carbonic acid is formed in red blood cells, it's the bicarbonate that is moved out to the plasma. And bicarbonate actually helps stabilize the blood pH, because bicarbonate can act as a buffer. The carbonic acid bicarbonate system is actually really the most important buffer system in the blood, because if you have excess hydrogen ions in the blood, they can combine with bicarbonate in the blood to form carbonic acid. So bicarbonate can help kind of trap up excess hydrogen ions and keep that blood pH at a stable roughly 7.4. Now, these associations between carbon dioxide and pH of blood mean that that problems with respiration can have an effect on your blood pH. You can have either respiratory acidosis, where your blood becomes too acidic, or respiratory alkalosis, where your blood becomes too basic. Respiratory acidosis happens if you have poor breathing or poor gas exchange. You get an increase in carbon dioxide in the blood and a decrease in blood pH. If it becomes too bad, it can lead to breathlessness, restlessness, even much more severe outcomes. So a drop in blood pH, an acidic blood pH, can indicate something bad happening with your respiratory system. Respiratory alkalosis usually the problem isn't primarily with the respiratory system. What happens is that if you have something else going on, if you have stress or pain and you're hyperventilating, you're breathing too rapidly and deeply, you're getting rid of too much carbon dioxide. And if you're getting rid of carbon dioxide, you're decreasing the carbonic acid in the blood, and the blood becomes more basic. So this can lead to dizziness or more serious outcomes as well. But it's not primarily because of respiratory dysfunction. It's more a symptom of something else that's happening that's causing you to hyperventilate. Okay, there are a few things that you should be able to discuss after studying this. You should be able to answer this question: why does oxygen need to be released from hemoglobin before it can be used by tissue cells? You should be able to describe the hemoglobin dissociation curve, analyze the hemoglobin dissociation curve, interpret changes to the hemoglobin dissociation curve. Talk about how oxygen dissociation is changed in metabolically active tissue, so the effect of heat, of blood pH, and carbon dioxide. And talk about how carbon dioxide is transported in the blood and why carbon dioxide affects the pH of the blood. This last little bit here, we'll talk about more when we talk about neural regulation of respiration.